Hello, and a very warm welcome to the Crash Course series on Queer Ecologies. This is the first part of the entire crash course, and this particular introductory session on an introduction to queer ecologies essentially delves into a fundamental introduction to the very concepts behind queer ecologies, to the discipline of queer ecologies itself, right? And the course deals with different kinds of concepts, very basic and preliminary concepts, theories, and principles guiding the entire trajectory of the discipline. Um, we shall be following an independent course plan to raise consciousness around the subject. A few of the most important theories around the rather large and vast discipline of queer ecologies includes intersectionality and several other aspects of gender, race, color, etc. Now we shall be moving on to the course overview. The purpose of this introductory course is to share knowledge and raise awareness around the recently developed academic discipline called queer ecologies. This first part shall shed light on the fundamental concepts and schemas which drives the foundational understanding of queer ecologies. And the purpose is to critically analyze the fundamental practices surrounding prevailing heterosexist discursive articulations of sexuality, nature, and institutionalized oppression. The intention behind making this crash course shall be to reimagine traditions as diverse as evolutionary biology, LGBTQIA+ movements, feminist science studies, ecofeminism, and environmental justice in light of queer theory. The coinage of the interdisciplinary term queer ecologies attempts to combat the normative ways of functioning, defying the binary standard definitions and essentialist perspectives. The videos have been organized in a manner that resonate with a format similar to lectures and holding discussion forums across the masses. This particular course overview basically reflects everything that we are going to be following through the course, including the kind of content that we are going to cover, the prominent theories that we are going to cover through the course, the purpose of the discipline, and the very intention behind making this crash course is obviously to defy binaries, is obviously to define norms, right? Because that is one of the most important facets of learning queer ecologies. That is to combat and not attempt to obey the normative styles of living or normative ways of living. We need to decompartmentalize, deconstruct everything that comes our way, critically examine it, question it, interrogate normative practices which are followed in the society, and develop alternative possibilities. That's the purpose, right? Now, moving on to the next slide, as you can see, understanding the nuances of the term queer. Now we shall be moving on to a couple of seminal works that I have chosen in order to substantiate my argument on uh, the subject matter of queer ecologies, right? Seminal works include a lot of prominent theorists and authors who have written uh, on vastly queer ecologies, but also there are other intersectional aspects surrounding this particular discipline, as I've already mentioned, around gender, intersectionality, feminism. Ecofeminism is a very important part of this particular course, as we shall be delving into that quite soon. This is a particular book called Word Slut, A Feminist Guide to Taking Back the English Language by Amanda Montell. Um, Now, Amanda Montell has very efficiently deconstructed the term queer and has, in a very humorous yet knowledgeable fashion, she has attempted to put down the folds and loopholes and nuances behind the term queer and how the very term queer emerged, right? Queer is still considered problematic by some, the term, but in the grand scheme of things, the word has evolved into a sort of self affirming umbrella term, right? So basically, what I'm trying to say is that queer is a label, one adopted by some people and rejected by others, right? So it cannot be used to describe individuals, a group of specific individuals or their gender orientations unless their preference is known to us. The Dictionary of American Slang says in the early 1990s, queer was adopted as a non pejorative designation by some homosexuals in the spirit of gay pride, right? Some sources trace the first adoption of queer as a positive self label to the group Queer Nation, founded in the early 1990s as a radical organization to combat violence against homosexuals. So basically, since then, queer has expanded beyond meaning only homosexual. In fact, queer does not have a single meaning. It does not have a very strict meaning. It's fluid, except perhaps not heterosexual. Some people who identify as neither male nor female call themselves genderqueer, while others who identify that same way might call themselves gender fluid or non binary. Now, moving on to the next slide, to set the foregrounding premise behind the concepts and theories surrounding queer ecologies, I have attempted to put down a bunch of really important words and terms, and I have named it as gender inclusive language guidelines. Right? We shall be looking into these terms, and as the slide is already mentioned here, you all can go through them for yourselves. Um, these kind of terms are very frequently used in the course of queer ecologies, or even in the disciplines of women's studies, gender studies, race studies, etc. Right? Words such as sexism, heterosexuality, genderqueer, cisgender, heteronormativity, etc. These terms sound very complex, but trust me, they are not that difficult to understand. And it is very important to raise consciousness, especially raise sensitivity around these terms, in order to proceed forward in this kind of a course where sensibility is really, really important. Only then we will be able to grasp the importance of such language guidelines, and only then we will be able to um, you know defy binaries and basically accentuate marginalized identities and their voices, right? Now, moving on to the next part, we are led to this next question, which is a very fundamental question when it comes to this entire course of queer ecologies, right? Like defining queer ecologies. What is it? What is the meaning behind the term? Unpacking this particular term, right? People often regard nature in terms of dualistic notions. This is what I talk about in terms of binaries. Why do we use the term binary? Because of this dualistic notion, like natural and unnatural, normal, abnormal, alive or not alive, human or not human, when in reality nature exists in a continuous state. The idea of natural arises from human perspectives of nature, not nature itself. Queer ecology rejects ideas of human exceptionalism and anthropocentrism that proposes that humans are unique and more important than other non human nature. Specifically, queer ecology challenges traditional ideas, right, regarding which organisms, species, and individuals have value. Queer ecology also states that heteronormative ideas saturate human understanding of nature and human society, and calls for the inclusion of queerness in environmental movements. It rejects the associations that exist between natural and heterosexual. And it draws attention to how both nature and marginalized groups have been historically exploited. Right. Now, as we have already talked about a very definitional understanding of queer ecologies, what do we understand from this? The basic argument is that the subject challenges traditional ideas and traditional biases, right? And it attempts to draw attention to how both nature and all these marginalized identities, they have been historically exploited. And there is nothing called natural. What we term as natural does not derive its meaning from nature, but from social constructions of nature, which have been created by us. Right? Moving on towards queer ecofeminism. Now, Greta Guards towards queer ecofeminism states that we have to examine how racism, heterosexism, classism, ageism, and sexism are all related to naturism, right? Love of nature is a process of becoming aware of and unlearning ideologies of racism, sexism, heterosexism, etc., so that we may cease to reduce our idea of nature to a dark, heterosexual, beautiful mother. Our idea of nature should not be restricted to just a mother, to just someone who provides, to just someone who is a beautiful mother, right? But it is not enough simply to add heterosexism to the long list of dominations that shape our relations to nature, to pretend that we can just add queers and stir, right? So basically, the conceptual linkages between women and animals, women and the body, or women and nature, for example, all of these serve to emphasize the inferiority of these categories, right? So it is exactly this kind of an approach that has characterized ecofeminist theory. Now we will be delving into ecofeminism quite soon, which is the reason I believe it is time for queers to come out of the woods and speak for ourselves, right? Now, as you can already see for yourselves, a few snippets, really important snippets from the article Towards a Queer Ecofeminism by Greta Gard has been mentioned here. You can go through them for yourselves.
By
Now,
way
moving
of
on.
introduction, I'd start by saying that ecofeminism is a body of environmental political theory that has been developing over the past 40 years or so, first in environmental philosophy and ethics, and then expanded and elaborated in various ways by scholars in different disciplines, sometimes using different labels such as feminist political ecology and feminist ecological economics. And I think it's important to point out that ecofeminist work in the environmental social sciences is probably somewhat more relevant to students of environmental politics, and it's also where I locate my work. But I'd also want to note that there's a lot of important ecofeminist work being done in the environmental humanities, in English and literary criticism, cultural studies, post-humanist philosophy, and so forth. So that being said, I think I want to say that I'm going to talk about academic ecofeminism, and it's important to say here that academic ecofeminism is very diverse and transdisciplinary. And what I'm presenting here is a view from the global north. And I'd want to stress that there are many different interpretations and practices of ecofeminism around the world. So Indian ecofeminism, as articulated in Vandana Shiva's work, for example, or the ecofeminisms being practiced by anti-mining activist women in South Africa, have very specific histories and features that I can't cover here, but I think that listeners should definitely be aware of. That said, I would explain ecofeminism as a critical theoretical lens that focuses on the many ways that gender as a construct shapes how people see and treat nature, as well as people's interactions with their environments. Ecofeminism takes as a starting point the fact that humans are embodied beings embedded in relationships whose survival depends on other humans, other species, and the more than human world. It's very critical of the
Right. So, as you all have already seen this particular video, I attempted to put a certain snippet out of this particular podcast. It's known as the Ecopolitics podcast. You all can watch them for yourselves. It's a very informative podcast series surrounding very important concepts on environmental feminism, ecological concerns, ecofeminism, most importantly. Um, This particular portion of the course focuses on ecofeminism, the larger concept of ecofeminism, and it has been defined as a women identified movement initially that sees Earth's devastation and the threat of nuclear annihilation as feminist concerns because they are underpinned by the same masculinist mentality that oppresses women, right? So, by analyzing how discourses of nature have been used to enforce heteronormativity and to punish and exclude those persons who have been deemed sexually transgressive, we can begin to understand the deep underlying commonalities between struggles against sexual oppression and other struggles for environmental justice, right? To queer nature is to acknowledge the complexities present in nature and to rid the interpretations of nature from human assumptions because that is very important. Through the lens of queer ecology, what we attempt to do is we attempt to understand that all living things are considered to be connected and interrelated. People apply queer ecology by letting go of ideas of what is natural. First, we have to get rid of these preconceived notions and assumptions of what we understand as natural versus unnatural because the first step of learning queer ecologies is to dismantle these binaries, getting rid of these generalizations and compartmentalizations, boxing them up in categories, generalizations of human and animal behavior. This is how a human is supposed to behave, this is how a certain animal is supposed to behave. No, not doing that, defying that, acknowledging the diversity of the natural world and facilitating discourse centered around queerness, right? Moving on to the next slide, which is on Z. Bomani's really important text called Now is the Time for Black Queer Feminist Ecology. This is another text which builds upon really important theories of queer ecologies. While it critiques structures of racism, sexism, heterosexism, classical, and other forms of oppression, it envisions a world. So basically, I'm talking about black queer feminist ecology at this point, right? Black queer feminist ecology builds upon different theories of ecofeminism, certainly. It critiques and it basically uh, puts down the structures of racism, sexism, heterosexism, and all other forms of oppression, of course. But it envisions a world that is not implicitly defined in opposition to those hierarchies. So basically, understanding the world not in opposition to a certain binary. Again, it becomes understanding the world in terms of binary opposites. Black queer feminist ecology poses the question that what if all these forms of oppression or B terms or inferior terms like blackness, queerness, femininity, what if all of these terms were not understood by definition in contrast to its superior A terms like whiteness, heterosexuality, cisgender identity, masculinity, and so on? But what if we could actually understand all these marginalized identities as fully realized, reconstructed identities, reconstructed from the violent fragmentation of subordination? So, as we reconstruct these identities, Black queer feminist ecology asks whether we might also reconstruct healthier ways of relating to animals, of relating to non humans, the environment, and amongst ourselves through reciprocal relationships, which also attempts to understand mutual caretaking obligations held between human beings and the natural ecosystem. Moving on to this particular slide, where I have basically put down an explanation of the previous slide, right? I have talked about the ideological constructions of nature and how that is shaped by our everyday discourses of gender and sexuality. What we understand as natural that has been increasingly influenced by heteronormativity, right? Um, One of the primary contestations against the prevalence of homosexuality is the belief that homosexuality does not exist in nature and homosexuality cannot be considered as normal, right? So queer ecologies also attempts to understand the genealogical trajectory of Why such categories like homosexuality is not natural? Why is it considered not natural? There is certainly a social construction behind that, which comes into play, right? Moving on to the
That
next
gender
slide.
is a feeble lens
This is a
through which to
very
view
important
any
slide
individual,
on Alex
and
Johnson's speech.
it is inadequate in order to characterize all of living, everything that's alive on this planet. It's time we accept it. Earth is not our mother. First, let's talk about accuracy. One of the most basic facts about this planet is that it's a roughly 4.5 billion year old, mostly molten chunk of rock hurtling through space. It, in and of itself, is not alive. It cannot procreate. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist within the evolutionary processes that have produced the sexual and physical differences which have informed our ideas of gender. Another basic fact about this planet is that it is inhabited by an incredibly diverse suite of living organisms. It's hard to overstate the degree of diversity of life on this planet. It's estimated there's roughly 1.5 million species of vertebrates and
Right. So, as we have already seen the TED Talk speech, it's actually available on YouTube. It's known as Earth is Not Your Mother. It's by Alex Johnson, this extremely famous, not famous as such, not like commercially famous, but he has produced a lot of intellectual and a lot of knowledge based production in the field of queer ecologies. His primary forte of research happens to be queer ecologies. um, Here I have mentioned in this slide about this one website called the Years Project. These references and these sources that I've used, they are absolutely legitimate and genuine, and they can be utilized by you to further research, right? There is a need for our understanding of queer to extend over human identities, right? As queerness has always been a part of our universe. I think it's very important to acknowledge that we all are queer in the very first place. As Alex Johnson mentions, that we contain multitudes. Queer ecologies is all about how we should be perceiving the world in terms of multitudes and 1,000 imagined possibilities. There are so many imagined possibilities or realities that could happen, right? Instead, all we tend to do is compartmentalize every aspect of our life into boxes. And gender also happens to be a very feeble way of deciding um, who needs to be who, right? Initially considered a way to refer to the normative in our contemporary world, the term queer has been defined as something which is paradoxical, contradictory, and counterintuitive, right? And this is verbatim said by the Years Project. Queerness in ecology is a concept broader than sexuality or gender identity. It is an all encompassing wink to weirdness in the more than human world and serves as an alternative to the binary and reductive modes of thought in which so many of us have been trained. It's like we have been conditioned and we cannot get out of that system. When I say queer ecology, I don't mean to say that we must impose our ideas of human sexuality onto nature. However, it is worth considering the anthropomorphism with which we view reproduction on this planet.
A lot of the
Moving on to
animals that
the
don't
next
fit
slide.
our ideas about what we want to see reflected in nature in general have been ignored. And I think that's another part of queer ecology, is really trying to look deeper into the ecologies themselves and look at things in relationship, and also to look at all these species that weren't as exciting or weren't considered as cute, even though I think bats are very cute.
I think they're very cute. It's a bit harsh.
Yeah, exactly. But maybe weren't as charismatic as far as, again, those more dominant or conventional scientific ideas. And there's also just ways where animals don't function the way that a nuclear family would. So I saw some hawks when we were arriving here today, and in hawks, the female is actually much larger than the male, which might be something we wouldn't think about in our idea of the gender binary and also sex binary for humans. Or there's lots of what might be seen as sexual behavior that doesn't necessarily have to do with reproduction, which also I think is something that's a big focus or has been a big focus in biology, that animals only behave or have sexual behaviors that have to do with reproduction, which just isn't true. A lot of the animals that don't fit our ideas about what we want to see reflected in nature in general have been
Yes,
ignored. And I think
and
that's another.
now finally moving on to the final slide of this video, the second last slide actually. Here I have mentioned about Vandana Shiva's work. Ecofeminists such as Vandana Shiva, they take a more politically radical position. I am absolutely in love with everything that she has mentioned and the kind of foregrounding theory or the kind of principle that she's abiding by. Ecological feminism creates the possibility of viewing the world as an active subject rather than a resource to be manipulated and appropriated, right? That's basically her argument. Therefore, indigenous resistance to imperialism is an affirmation of life, it's a celebration of culture, and it's a defense of the earth. So the struggle is basically to save life on the planet from a dominant patriarchal and capitalist worldview. And unless queer individuals, in fact, take the lead, she believes that there cannot be any sustainable future. She attempts to talk about how science and technology are not gender neutral, and how all these large global corporate initiatives, basically these tech driven initiatives like Green Revolution and such, they reflect a dominant ideology of capitalism, imperialism, and economic growth, um, which is basically created by the Western technological man, again, standing from a very elitist, privileged position. In this drive for growth, women or queer individuals and nature, they are viewed as objects to be controlled, they are viewed as objects to be owned, and in turn, both are exploited, right? That is basically her argument. And finally, we move to the next and the final slide where I have mentioned about the basic argument in a nutshell. We are not separate from nature, nature is not divisible, everything is interconnected. The better the nature is, the better we are being able to say no to ecological mandates, the better we are being able to say no to discursive, conventional, heteronormative ways of living, the better it is. We cannot have a future where the one person claims all of the planet's resources, continuing on the path of separation and apartheid, resource extraction and pollution. So it's very important to look at it from a very intersectional lens, wherein people from across different intersections of gender, race, caste, color, etc., will have the access to resources, but at the same time will also have the access to protect, preserve the natural resources, because the better that is, the better it is for us, right? Um, we quickly glide through the larger structure of concepts and the prominent concepts which have been covered, basically the umbrella terms and hunches we went through the course. Queer ecologies mainly derives its primary significance from a very deep rooted intersection with several other identity markers, as I've already mentioned, and most importantly, nature. The prominent concepts covered include unpacking the term queer, fundamental concept of queer ecologies, um, of ecofeminism, intersectionality, and environmental feminism. Black Radical Queer Feminist Ecology, that is an article by Z. Bomani. Please have a look. Genealogy of Queer Ecologies. There is again a popular culture reference to Brokeback Mountain in that particular book, and it happens to be one of the best books to actually start, like a very basic um, head start in terms of understanding queer ecologies. If you are new in this field, please feel free to go through that particular book. It's known as The Genealogy of Queer Ecologies, An Introduction to Queer Ecologies, right? It's written by Katina Sanders. And we have Catriona Sanders, I'm so sorry about that. And we have Vandana Shiva's contribution in the field of ecofeminism, wherein right in the like the slide right before this. and also Alex Johnson's Earth is Not Your Mother, Queering Ecology. There's another article called One Goose at a Time. All of these articles have been referred to and recommended to by my professor. Um, and they are absolutely amazing. If anybody wishes to start the course, right? So I hope this particular course, or rather the larger scopus, the larger understanding of queer ecologies, I hope it brings attention to the importance of breaking norms. I hope it helps us view things from a very non-compartmentalized, non-binary sort of vision, which should be fluid. And I hope we are able to defy our existence in all these boxes, right? So, thank you so much. That is me signing off.